أهلا وسهلا مرة ثانية فيكم اللي معانا موجودين اليوم واللي معانا أونلاين. طول الوقت احنا بنتكلم عن النوستالجيا وعن الحنين، اتكلمنا عن الأرشفة وقد إيش احنا مرة مهم نحافظ على كل هذه المعلومات والفنون عشان الأجيال اللي بعدنا يشوفوها. للمحفوظات والسجلات أشكال كثيرة ومتنوعة، فيها حكايات كثير نبغى نخليها ونبغى نحتفظ بيها بطريقة تخلي الفنانين من بعد يستمتعوا ويستفيدوا بالجهد اللي سووه الأشخاص اللي قبلهم. إيش اللي يستطيع اليوم الفنانون القيام فيه عشان يقدروا يعبروا عن زمننا الحاضر بطريقة أفضل نحو الأجيال المستقبلية. معانا اليوم مايا أليسون، المدير التنفيذي لمعرض الفنون بجامعة نيويورك أبو ظبي، رئيس القيمين الفنيين في جامعة نيويورك أبو ظبي، كما وأنها القيم على الجناح الوطني لدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة في البندقية. شغلت مناصب كثير ومنها كانت منصب القيم في جامعة براون، وأشرفت على إدارة المعرض الدولي السنوي لوسائل الإعلام Pixelations. تحمل أليسون شهادات من جامعة كولومبيا وكلية ريد، كما وأنها حائزة على الزمالة البحثية في الإشراف على المتاحف من مركز براون الجامعي. Welcome, Maya.
Hello, welcome. It's my great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the host for organizing this conversation. It's an honor to share the screen with Professor Nada Shabout, Lara Baladi, and Mariam Al-Dabakh. Today we are discussing the archive, and our hope for this conversation is to take you into new ways of thinking about the archive, because for everyone who works with an archive, there's somebody else who works with a different kind of archive. And on this panel today are three very different perspectives and ways of thinking about archive and practice. And what I want to do is start with just having each of the panelists introduce themselves. If you could tell us your name and a little bit about your practice, and then from there we can lead our way into our conversation. Let's see, Nada Shabout, please.
Who are we starting with?
With Nada.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm Nada Shabout. I am a professor of art history at the University of North Texas and the coordinator of the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Cultural Studies initiative at the same university. I specialized in modern contemporary art from the Arab world, and I curate at times.
Thank you very much. Lara Baladi, will you go next?
Yes, of course. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm Lara Baladi. I'm currently located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I teach at MIT. I teach visual arts at MIT. And I've been working in the region based in Egypt for more than 20 years as a visual artist and working with institutions such as the Arab Image Foundation, the Townhouse Gallery, and currently I just joined a wonderful new initiative in New York called the Artist Sanctum on the board of directors. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Oh, congratulations, that's great. Mariam Al-Dabakh.
Hi, صباح الخير, مرحبا, مساء الخير. اسمي مريم دباغ. My name is Mariam Debagh. I'm a writer and a researcher and a translator. I also run a consultancy here based in the UAE and work with cultural projects and museums in the Gulf. My personal practice is archiving and storytelling of complex histories of Arab immigrants, specifically here in the Gulf region.
Welcome. Good. So I want to start with the definition of the word archive, which I think is something that we think we know what it is. The first thing that comes to mind for me are rows and rows of boxes full of papers, well organized, filed away, and in them I can discover some piece of history that hasn't yet been written, right? This is my experience with a historian doing research in the archive. But then there's also what I remember, and everything that I remember, and all the pieces of my life that I compile to make sure to help me remember my life. And I think, is that an archive? Is a list of my memories an archive? And to what end? What does an archive do? If you're not a historian, do we leave the archives to the historians to tell us what's in them and to tell those stories? Don't we want to find our own stories in the archives? And there's this sort of aura of the archive as something that's only accessible in the hushed halls of a library or in a research center of some kind. And yet now we're seeing, for some time now, I think for the better part of the last 20 years, I would say, we're seeing a move of the archive into artistic practice, the fictional archives, sort of challenging the archive, but also discovering that the very notion of, say, for example, an art historical canon starts to fall apart once you start considering other archival sources. And so from that vantage point, I think this is an incredible group to have together because each of you are bringing these perspectives to us. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you on the general question of what the archive is and does for you specifically and your perspective on it. I want to start with Lara Baladi. So you founded Vox Populi, a project that lives, I believe, on a website in part. And the website describes it as an open source timeline and portal into web-based archives of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution and other global social movements. You mentioned that you began it as a way to keep track of events unfolding on the ground, but you expanded to include material on events around the world, as well as other material that paralleled and resonated with these events. And this includes philosophical texts, events from other periods. And so the whole notion of the archive then starts to become more complicated than the sort of strict definition that we might have started with. Could you speak to the concept of the archive from your perspective as an artist creating and using archives, but specifically about the archives which have emerged from Tahrir Square and your archive, those archives in particular?
Yes, thank you for this great description of my work.
Okay.
Yes, I'll start with a little bit more of a general approach as an artist and an artist who started with the medium of photography. I think what's interesting about the practice of photography and my practice when I became aware of my need to collect and to work on different matters around the Arab region is the relationship and the intrinsic connection between images and archives. As a photographer, you produce images, and therefore the next step is to organize them, to archive them. And so I think this is this was something that was very spontaneous and inherent to my practice, and I took it to many different levels through time with the work which I did with the Arab Image Foundation and looking at photography in the region and the history of photography which needed to be written. When the events in Tahrir Square and in the region in general started in 2011, and I would say actually 2010, sorry, in Tunisia, the relationship with photography became a completely new relationship, where suddenly we were aware of a very different mode of functioning, of producing, of mediatizing events, historical events. And the whole digital production that emerged from the square was a real moment of shift in the history of photography itself and media production. And what triggered my interest in archiving was the realization that some of the events we were experiencing were very similar to events in history that had happened in very different places at very different times. And it's that analogy between different moments in space and different and images that actually were archetypally the same, that sort of triggered this, this practice of collecting data that came out of the conversation on social media that took place during 2011 and the aftermath of the uprisings. So in my case, the idea of archives was more about, at that moment, looking at archives of resistance and how these uprisings were creating archive as a way of resisting. And so my definition, or my, let's say, my lens through which I would like to speak today of archive is definitely the lens of collecting for resistance.
That's really interesting. Can I ask you a follow-up question there? I'm wondering if, when you say the data, the social media, so for you, the archive extends to anything that can be produced in any context that you can then organize to be part of the telling of that story. Do you set limits? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I think I have the privilege as an artist to not be a historian.
Right.
And so there's a sort of freedom and a way of thinking about history or memory, to go back to your introduction, from a very unethical, not unethical, but unmethodical or non-methodical approach. To be honest, the beginning of this project was very instinctive. I was in Cairo and I was part of what was happening, and as a way of dealing with the day-to-day events, but the energy that we were part of and the movement that was shifting every minute, that was something that I needed to do for the way that I function. I needed to collect so that I could reflect later. It was too fast to reflect immediately on what was happening. So it started very instinctively and almost as a way of surviving the moment, in a sense of trying to make sense of things and getting excited about, oh my God, this is happening. Who are these people? Who is producing this? The novelty also of the expression and the self-expression that emerged from the common citizen, who until now was not really producing or speaking out, was also what generated my interest in the kind of creative wave that took place in that moment. And so the social media space became an interesting space of analysis for me, because since the beginning of my practice, I've always been interested in popular iconography and in popular visual language. And in that moment in the Arab world, a new form of visual language was emerging, and I got very hooked to analyzing and understanding what this iconography was about.
Thank you very much. That helps me sort of imagine, and I like the sort of the way that the methodology sort of opens up when you give yourself permission to let it be what it wants to be or needs to be in that moment. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Nada Shabut, and I can only imagine that your relationship to the archive is vast and complicated. I think most notably the fact that you founded an archive for modern art Iraq archive almost 20 years ago, it looks like. And I wonder if you could talk about how you view the archive in relationship to the field of art history and your practice, and your role, in fact, in establishing an archive in order to conduct your practice in some ways. It's almost as if to do one, you need to first do the other, or both simultaneously. Over to you.
Indeed. Thank you, Maya. And it's really interesting to sort of think about this right after what Lara just said, because so my relationship with archives are, like you said, very complicated. And it started me as a graduate student wanting to study modern Arab art, and a field that didn't exist almost 30 years now ago, and with the popular myth that there are no archives in the 20th century Arab world, and so how are we going to write the historiography of it? Because essentially, to me, archives were the method, or the what allows me, what would enable me to tell the stories of the modern art in the Arab world, the history of modern art in the Arab world. And so looking for the archives, I basically encountered sort of what you said about personal stories, because at the end, those are the 20th century artist personal stories in various ways, as well as, of course, the official stories that come out in newspapers, as well as any institutional records. So trying to find this, and as you said, this very much sort of helps subvert the mainstream sort of stories that the canon of art history says, with the sort of absence of modernism from the Arab world in the canon. So, but it has taken more than 20 years trying to find and change the story. And our story of modern art in the Arab world keeps changing based on the archives that we find, because these are the voices from those who were participating in the scene and producing the modern art in the 20th century. And it's amazing every time I read a biography, or which is personal history, or look at some new documents, and like, for example, the ones we translated, Annika Linson, Sarah Rogers, and I, for the Modern Art in the Arab World primary document book that was published by MoMA 2018. I mean, that was basically archives that we translated to make accessible. So there's that one story of how to use the archives to write the history. But then there was a whole other sort of way of looking at archives after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and destruction of its cultural heritage, particularly for me, as far as my work goes, modern art of Iraq, where it felt an urgency to preserve that memory, so that there's this connection to memory in a very different way than it was for writing the history. And so the Modern Art Iraq Archive, my site that I started almost 20 years ago now, you say, which is amazing, wanted to basically open up a forum for Iraqi people to be able to share their memories, in terms of whether it's the visual memory of the destruction of the Museum of Modern Art, or textual, because, again, then we needed also the stories, the voices of everyone. And so it started as a way of trying to sort of assess what has been lost, and turned into a reservoir for, shared memory, as well as a way of writing the other stories, connecting to the historical ones. And social media became actually a very important part of this, because of nostalgia, which is sort of, a theme here as well. Many Iraqis started uploading, whatever pieces of memory that they have in photography, photos, or, text, on Facebook and Instagram and other places, which became sort of a very important source for me to mine.
Thank you very much. I'm especially struck how there's the initial effort to build and collect archival material to tell the art history, and the shift to this kind of crowdsourcing of memory, which is in fact also a kind of archive. And this passing reference you made to biography and archive, and of course biographies and autobiographies may or may not be fictional, but then again, that's true for memory as well, right? And so it's a beautiful and impossibly imprecise practice, right? Okay, so now to Maryam Al-Dabakh, who is a writer and researcher and incredible translator, whose practice focuses on the nature of immigrants, permanent temporality, specifically in the UAE. And you recently did a piece for the Jamil Arts Center that includes an audio piece, a beautiful audio piece. I would encourage the audience to look it up. And in that piece, you talk about Sharjah as a reflection of the many different sort of migrant communities or residents of Sharjah, and how they bring their memories with them and sort of re-embody them in the shops along the streets. And I think you have this phrase that I love: each street and shop becomes a medium to express what has been left behind. In a way, it is as if your memories and what you have observed in the course of your life in the UAE becomes an archive. And through your eyes, we can see the streetscape as an archive of cultures and migration. How do you think of the word archive in relation to your work? And were you thinking of it this way when you started this project?
Thank you, Maya, for this lovely introduction. I'm obviously honored to be speaking with some of the people that I'm a big fan of. I mean, I've been following the works of Dr. Nada Shabout personally since I was in university. And of course, Lara's project in 2011 completely changed my life. So I'm really honored to be here. I couldn't just start it. But I've always looked at archive in writing. So I've had this habit of writing and documenting things that are happening in our lives because of the gravity of things that happened in my short life. So I was born in the 80s in the UAE, and I was born into the Iraq-Iran war, and the narrative in the UAE towards Iraqis then was very different than 1990, which was a year between the end of the Iraq-Iran war, a year and a half, 2 years, and the Kuwait war. And I remember these major shifts happening in the UAE having a really severe effect on me and my understanding of my identity. So I started at a very young age just writing the things that I see. Things that I'm encountering in Sharjah, where I lived back then, things that my parents are talking about, and then whatever piece of document we had at home, be it a hospital bill, the TV insurance card, my mom saved. She saved everything, and we never understood why. So we've had these boxes and boxes of irrelevant, what we believed were irrelevant documents and papers, while I was, on the other hand, writing everything that I'm going through because I didn't know enough about collecting these pieces of information or these documents. And then fast forward years and years, and obviously everything that has happened to our home country, which made that coveted return impossible, we stayed. So my parents stayed, although their initial plan in '78 was to stay for 1 year in the UAE, but they're still here. Come COVID, and what ended up happening is that prior to COVID, an interesting thing happened that my parents wanted to move back home to Mosul, to Iraq. And so they packed up everything. And in the process of us packing almost 45 years of our life, I came across this treasure of documents and papers and stories that are not told. And I started asking myself the question, isn't this the history of the UAE as well? Like, isn't this a micro history of the country that we are living in? And why aren't we talking about this history? Why aren't we interrogating these images, these documents, these archives as a method of presentation, but also storytelling? I wanted, with several discussions with the Jamil Library team at the Jamil Arts Center, they commissioned this interesting work that became a story told about this family and the histories that this family has gone through. But the written narrative, what people listen to and what people read on the walls of the Jamil Arts Center, is just sort of the facade, really, of these thousands and thousands of documents that my parents collected. And the collection of the archive then was a way of, it's both a reminder of the history that they have in the UAE for us and for them, but it's also a resource for constructing a different history of the UAE. It became almost, and the way that I saw it, it became almost an archive of proof of belonging, that we belong here, we've lived here, these are our stories in a way. And it became, and the way that I looked at it, it was an overlap between archives of a family life, but also of a geopolitical kind of circumstances that affected this family life in this specific place. And of course, these materials were dispersed all over. So the collection, the act of collecting these materials together became a process of understanding a segment of the history of the country that we are in. And this is how the project realized itself. But I am a storyteller, I'm a writer, and I'm in love with Hikayat and Shahrazad. And so I created a Shahrazad-like stories on the walls of the Jameel Art Center.
Wonderful. I can't wait to see it. I haven't been able to get up there yet, but I was really glad there was something online for me to access. You use this phrase, the archive, as a proof of belonging. And I think it's a very interesting kind of in parallel to the statement about these are also micro-histories of the UAE, which of course they are. You know, when we see the history of an individual, we see the history of the country through the eyes of that individual. And the act of seeing through those eyes, I think sort of to frame that as a proof of belonging is poignant and beautiful, and reminds me, in fact, of how we talk about any history, and including art history and the canon, and what belongs, what's worth studying, and what stories are worth telling. And that if we think, you know, of course, from the perspective of curating art, something that we think is worth keeping track of versus something that we think is, you know, well, this artist was a second-rate artist, so we're not going to write that history, you know. And that there's this sort of odd hierarchy of proof of belonging that comes into play anytime you choose what to archive and what not to archive. I wonder, does somebody else want to pick up this question? Yeah, Nada, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was struck with what both Mariam and Lara were saying. Lara about sort of the freedom of not being a historian and what to do with the archives. And then, you know, Mariam taking this sort of the personal approach to the family history. And as opposed to me as an art historian who somehow never thought about my personal, for example, history as part of the archive. Because now as I hear Mariam, I think about this, how much I have lost, or the objects that I don't have, coming from, I mean, I have a Palestinian mother and an Iraqi father who have been displaced so many times that we have no material objects. But I grew up with the belief of I heard Edward Said, the late Edward Said, say one time that, you know, don't want to have material objects so you don't belong to anywhere. And to me, that was my sort of, you know, approach to my personal archives. But now I'm coming to the realization a bit too late that, you know, it would have helped me tell some of the stories that I am telling, because at the end, this is what art history is. And, you know, it is in ways of telling stories that we try to make them more objective. And so we can justify, you know, the way we study some artists as opposed to not other artists. So I think it's really interesting how with time and with more loss, you know, the idea of an archive, even to a historian, is changing.
I would, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Laura.
No, go ahead. I'm going to ask a question.
No, I want to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something that I feel connects all of us, and actually maybe all archives in nature, is the absence of archive. And I think we all mentioned it in a different way. And in the case of the Tahrir, all the types of archives that were born from Tahrir and the Arab uprisings, there is what I'm thinking about is more specifically the loss of data through the algorithm of the Google search engine of the internet. So there's a sense of loss that's associated to archive and absence, and I think it's a very important notion for why we're having this conversation today, when archives are something we talk about forever and again, and it feels like an old conversation, but somehow talking about archives today, I think it's important to put it into the context of this absence but absence as a place to revisit history. And so kind of putting a light on what is not there in the archive to rewrite history, and to, to pick up on Ariela Azule's new work on learning imperialism, and this idea of bringing out archives that don't exist, that should exist, or that should have been kept, or that should have been created, to really understand the reality of a history that we are all an outcome of. And so, yes, I just wanted to pick up on that notion, and why today, in the context of, I'm based in the US right now as we speak. So of course, I've been watching very closely the anti-racist movements that have been taking place here. And so there's this whole necessity to go back and rethink how things have been conveyed to us. And so yes, so I think this is an interesting point that connects our practices.
Sure. I'm aware that we have 1 minute left and that they're going to go straight to the next event after this. So I want us to be able to wrap up. But I really think this is an incredible conversation, and I hope that we can have this conversation again, because it makes me want to archive everything. and this artist Laurie Anderson has this quote that she says, when her father died, it was like a whole library had burned down, right? Mm-hmm. So we have all these memories. And so this, to our audience, write down what you remember, because nobody else can. How's that?
Absolutely. So much.
Thank you, Laura, Nada, and Mary. And thank you to the organizers and Laura Egerton and Misk very much.
Yeah, thank you to everybody.
You.
And
thank you.
So honored to be among all of you.
Yeah.
Me too. Thank you so much.